Before we dive into existential psychology, I wanted to cover the topic nostalgia briefly because it's such an interesting and fascinating conversation. My first question when I was thinking of nostalgia is the history. At what point does the topic of nostalgia go from this abstract, kind of flimsy theory to something that is taken seriously in the world of psychology?
The history of nostalgia is complicated, and it's not like there's a single point where this happened. But what you can see is if you go back to the late 1600s, which was when the term nostalgia was coined, you do see an attempt at a scholarly approach because it was very much supposed to be a medical condition, and there was all sorts of speculations about the brain and different processes involved. But it wasn't scientific at all. And then you can see, you can fast forward to the mid 20th century, and that you started to see really people in advertising and consumer psychology take interest in it. And there were other people, there were some sociologists and other people kind of speculating about it. But it was really like marketing researchers that started to try to quantify how much we are motivated by our longing for the past. And marketing, of course, what they were really interested in is what do we buy based on that. So, there was early research that turns out that men tend to like cars that remind them of their youth, and you can see this in other areas too. But then it wasn't until really the last 20 years that you started to see a more systematic and scientific approach to nostalgia, looking beyond just simple correlations into like actually, doing a bunch of different experiments in which we try to randomly assign people to different conditions to see how nostalgic reflection actually influences other types of cognitions, emotions, motivations, and related issues.
It's interesting to hear that there was a spark for marketers and buying decisions because I actually had a note here. I see it all the time, advertisers on even this podcast, or you think of the role of legacy movies where we'll do sequel after sequel, or nostalgic cover songs where artists are now remaking songs from 20 years ago. So it does seem like this affects buying decisions. And why is that? Why do we pull out the pocketbook when we feel nostalgia?
Yeah, well, part of that is we buy things that we enjoy and we think we get some value out of, which really speaks to, okay, well, what is it about your past? Because on the one hand, you might say as a consumer, you should crave novelty. You should want new experiences. You should want to make purchases to allow you to do things you haven't done before. But what the early marketing researchers observed, and which is really only like further supported by our more careful experimental research, is a lot of the things we value connect us to the past. And this doesn't mean that people are just trying to relive the past. It means they want to connect some aspect of their past that they find personally meaningful or informative to their current life and even to their future goals. So to take the example of like the making sequels to movies, sure, sometimes they're not very imaginative and not even very good, and they are kind of cash-ins. But a lot of times what people are interested in is, hey, there's this story that I would thought was really cool when I was young, and I have a lot of memories wrapped around that, probably memories with friends or family or other things going on. And I would like to preserve some element of that, but make it more relevant to today, to cultural changes, to life changes, the things I'm interested in today. And I think really where you can see some cool innovation and creativity in entertainment is when they're able to capture that spark from the past, but then do something new or different that gets you thinking about it in a different direction, or maybe makes it more applicable to current challenges and issues. So I think nostalgia can be done in a way that's actually very creative and novel. That doesn't mean it always is, but we definitely feel some desire to have some kind of continuity or connection with the past.
It's interesting you mentioned that spark. That must be such an art form because you think of technology, how I want to spend on, we were just talking about our MacBooks. I want to spend on the new Apple product. I want to see what the future is. But there's also the pull to the past. So finding that spark and creativity is almost like an art form. But you mentioned that the feelings of childhood we briefly talked about. Is there any truth to my follow-up thought that if somebody frames their childhood as a poor experience, that they are less likely to care about nostalgia, less likely to make decisions based on nostalgia if they have framed their earlier memories as negative?
Yeah, so I think that part of that is true in the sense that if you're trying to get a benefit from nostalgia, let's say, for instance, a social benefit, a lot of nostalgic experiences involve close others. And so if you feel like, well, actually, my past is full of relationship failures, or I don't feel necessarily attached to, to certain people in the past, then how is that going to help me in the present? So I think there is an element of that, but that's a partial. That's only part of the story, because another way of thinking about it is most people, luckily, their past isn't just all bad or all good, and even bad experiences in the past can be educational. So you can actually find some interesting nostalgic stories from people. So, for instance, we collected data from older British adults. This was, almost 20 years ago, and a lot of them had childhood memories that during World War II, and some of these were very traumatic memories. But at the same time, like, there's all this upheaval and stress and anxiety and fear, but that was juxtaposed with life lessons about how precious life is, and how important family is, and stripping away kind of the some of the nonsense of life and getting really focused on what's most meaningful. And so even negative life experiences can be clarifying and can be inspirational and can, if nothing else, give people some sense of like what not to do and how to learn a lesson. And so I think that nostalgia has that kind of emotional complexity as well. It's not just happy memories. When we think about consumerism, of course, we think about, oh, like, I really liked Star Wars when I was a kid. It made me happy, and so I'm nostalgic about it. But a lot of the deeper memories that involve life's challenges and difficulties can have elements of nostalgia, even if they cause some pain. And it is an emotion that's pleasure mixed with pain. And so I think that's a distinguishing feature of nostalgia compared to other types of memories, perhaps.
On that note, is there a theory or a working theory for the evolutionary or survival benefit for experiencing nostalgia? Is there a working theory that a lot of people are behind?
So I wouldn't say there's necessarily a working theory. I mean, it would be easy to kind of tell a story of nostalgia as adaptive, and I certainly think that, based on all the research that we've done that show all of its psychological and motivational functions, that makes sense. But we haven't necessarily like explicitly couched it in evolutionary terms. But I think if you think about the functions of a lot of cognition, so nostalgia has this cognitive element in that it's memories, right? We're reconnecting with memories, but it also has this very affective or emotional element, which is that there's, like I said, there's some pleasure, there's some pain, there's loss, but there's also gratitude. And I do think certainly in the emotions literature, there's a lot of work on the evolutionary advantage of both positive and negative emotions, how they inform us and how they guide cognition and goal setting. And so I think nostalgia kind of fits within that framework as well.
So I want to pivot to existential psychology for those who are interested in nostalgia, which is very fascinating. Your video on TED's page, Why Do We Feel Nostalgia, is going to be linked in our description. It's very interesting and to the point. But going to existential psychology, and forgive me for going so wide, but can you give me a pretty simple or basic definition for what is existential psychology?
So, I mean, the simplest way to describe it would be existential psychology really, concerns the psychological study of big existential questions, questions related to the nature of our existence. But that can fall into different categories. So there's a bunch of people in existential psychology who study the unique awareness of mortality. And so what does it mean to be an organism that on the one hand strives for survival, wants to avoid threats and stay alive and healthy as long as possible, but on the other hand is acutely aware of the inevitability of our demise. And so does that create interesting cognitive dissonance for humans to be like, I know I'm going to die and I don't, but I'm doing all this stuff to avoid death. There's people that do that. There's broader questions about meaning in life, which of course connects to death, because a lot of times when we think about our mortality, what we do to comfort ourselves is to say, well, I want to live I can't do anything about the fact I'm going to die, but I can make an impact. I can have some part of me that transcends my earthly mortality. That could be religious, that could be symbolic, that could be cultural, professional. But also there are questions about free will. There are questions about our social connections, related to loneliness and isolation. Like, can people really get me? Do people really understand me? How do I connect my unique individual experience to other people's experiences? So really things wrapped around those questions that are really about being a very intelligent organism that's able to reflect on our own existence and our own place in the world.
On a personal level, what drove you to take this career path, and what was your spark of motivation to learn the ins and outs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not really sure why why I was especially interested in existential psychology. When I was an undergraduate student, I was very interested in philosophy in general and these big questions. I remember I had a philosophy professor that said, "Don't go to graduate school in philosophy; you'll never get a job." And so, there was a practical interest too, in like, well, what can I do that I can gain employment? And I ended up becoming very fascinated in psychology. And there's a field called social psychology that is not inherently existential psychology, but it gets to some of these questions, especially about human cultural and social life. And so I started going down that path. But then when I got to graduate school, I discovered that, there are actually empirical psychologists, so people doing, quantitative research on how people grapple with these big questions. And so I can actually perhaps pursue some of my philosophical interests, but using more of the modern tools of empirical science.
When thinking of like grappling with these impossibly big questions, is there any truth to the cliche ignorance is bliss? Are there some people who will be less happy, more anxious, more depressed by asking these questions? That's a big question mark that we've asked a lot on this podcast, but these questions, they don't lead to clear-cut answers. And would you say some people are happier leaving these questions alone?
Yeah, it's almost like maybe you know this, what's the saying in Spider-Man? With great power comes great responsibility. It's something like that, right? I mean, being intelligent like humans is like saying like great intelligence comes with great anxiety. So it is true that higher levels of self-consciousness, our ability to introspect on ourselves, spending time in our own heads, is a recipe for anxiety and distress. We can run not only, about the big questions about death and meaning, but even, relatively day-to-day concerns such as giving, ask students if they like giving a public lecture, or what I mean, or concerns about like, are people going to make fun of me based on what I wear? I mean, all the self-consciousness that's involved with being a human being, starting in a relatively early age as our brains really develop and we become our own people when we're kids and adolescents. It comes with anxiety. It comes with distress. And so, on the one hand, yes, you could imagine that. Well, we might be more, we might be better adjusted psychologically if we just weren't introspective about these things. But on the other hand, part of what makes life fulfilling and part of what's allowed us to do so many cool things as a species is our intelligence. And so I think there is a, you know, there was a book written, I think it was in, maybe in the 90s, called by social psychologist Mark Leary, called The Curse of the Self. And it was kind of a recognition of that. Like being a self-conscious organism comes with, all the fears and anxieties associated with that level of intelligence. But I would say a fulfilling and a meaningful life also means, grappling with these issues. And so I think that, yeah, it can cause stress, but it can also be a source of inspiration. In addition to that, there are practical things that people can do, such as if you find yourself sitting around and like just introspecting about your existential condition all the time and you find it really depressing, go out and do things. Like get out of your head, take action, because as it turns out, being engaged in the world, going out, trying to make a difference, working, helping others, making friends, having families, these things take you, they're cognitively involved, but they take you out of your head and they put you into the world. And I think that you can work on balancing that as well.
That was very well put. But that would also lead to, what is terror management theory and why is it so important?
So terror management theory is a specific theory within the existential psychology tradition that's very much focused on specifically on the awareness of death. And so the reason it's called terror management theory is the idea or the proposal from the theory, which is actually based on the writings of Ernest Becker, who won a Pulitzer Prize, nonfiction Pulitzer Prize, I think in the early 70s, for his book, The Denial of Death. And basically the idea that they propose is that being aware of death is terrifying. Like being an organism motivated to live and fully realizing that you could die. And not only could you die today. You could get hit by a bus today. You could have a tumor growing in you that is slowly killing you. All sorts of things could happen. So it's not only are you going to die, but you can die for reasons that are difficult to predict or control. And so, according to terror management theory, that has the potential, at least, to create a considerable amount of anxiety or terror. But of course, people aren't cowering in the corner, afraid. They're living their lives. In fact, we do risky things all the time that actually put us in danger. And so the theory, tries to explain that. How do we live fully in the world, knowing the inevitability of our mortality? When the theory says that, well, people adopt certain strategies as a way to mitigate their potential anxiety about death. These include cultural worldviews, so whether they're religious or secular, that order the world and give us some sense of meaning and ideally some sense of transcendence, that, part of me lives on in some way. And also self-esteem, that gives me it's my individual project within a broader cultural framework of meaning. And so according to the theory, if you have self-esteem and if you're invested in a cultural worldview, that keeps that kind of suppresses the potential fear of death. And that's just one specific theory. There are other theories that focus more broadly on anxiety, on existential anxiety, not just death anxiety, but other types of anxieties. But that's been a very prominent theory. And it has, there is a kind of a long-standing debate about specific things of the theory that we don't have to necessarily get into. But one thing I do want to note that I think the theory should get a lot of credit for, whether you agree with it or not, is it really pushed existential psychology into mainstream social psychology. And a lot of people weren't asking these types of questions because they thought they were too abstract or too philosophical. Some social psychologists don't think they're even interesting questions. Like, oh, who cares about, that's for theology and that's for philosophy. But I think what the terror management theory and its early researchers did is said, no, these are important questions. Whether you agree with our theory or not, clearly humans grapple with big questions about the nature of their life and death that warrant empirical investigation.
While I kind of obviously understand why we would evolve for a survival benefit of understanding that we can die, understanding that death is inevitable, I understand that as a survival benefit, but our urge or our motivation to understand or have meaning, I guess I'm a little bit more confused of where that would come in as a survival benefit, or why as humans that we are so drawn to the question of meaning versus other animals. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no.
Why meaning matters for survival?
Yeah. So I think different people would answer it differently. One way to think about it is, relates to what you just said about compared to other animals. I think you can make an argument that other animals also, in their way, make meaning. And so what I mean by that is you can think about meaning at multiple levels of complexity. So at a very low cognitive level, you might say meaning making is just basic sense making. So I need my environment to make sense. If my environment's chaotic, it's not predictable, if the laws of physics change day to day, then I can't survive. Like I can't live. I'm a pattern recognition machine. But that's not just me. That's my dog too. That's other animals, right? They need to make sense of their environment. So you can think about even at a very, very low level of the world needs to make sense, right? In order for me to navigate it. Now, if you start to go up in levels of self-consciousness and intellect, what you'll find is because I can introspect, because I can think about myself and my place in the world, in addition to just basic sense making of the world, I also want to make sense of my existence. I want to make sense of my life. And that actually, just like being able to navigate the world based on some patterns and rules, is helpful for me being successful at securing food and shelter and things like that. Being able to make sense of my life is helpful for helping me organize myself in groups, to connect with others, to pursue goals and interests that are, that maybe are really, really long-term focused. I mean, one thing that's cool about humans is we don't just live moment to moment in a stream of consciousness. We do things that might not be realized for decades, right? We buy homes and pay on mortgages for decades and things like that. Well, you have to be able to imagine a distant future to pursue those goals. Some of our goals extend beyond our own lives. Like a scientist might say, I don't know if there's going to be a cure for this disease I'm working on in my lifetime, but my research contributes to a bigger project that's in the pursuit of that goal. Meaning serves that higher level, like it's kind of survival focus, like of moving beyond just day-to-day existence and the potential chaos and uncertainty and stress that goes with that, to organizing my life in a way that helps keep me focused and on track and in the pursuit of big projects.
It's really interesting how you talked about the levels of meaning, and even in me asking that question, it's very like ego driven, where it's like, why do humans need to know the meaning of life? You're like, well, actually, there are various levels of meaning. So that's very interesting. But in a very real world example, let's say someone's listening right now, they're in their mid 20s. What is the greatest predictor of a young person feeling like they have meaning in a very real world setting?
Yeah, so there's actually research on different facets of meaning, or different dimensions. And one of the things that people find is it's really that sense, or the thing that seems to matter most is what we call a sense of mattering. And so I need to feel like I'm making a contribution that matters. So it's not just I want to be liked, or I want to be successful, or all these things that we like and that certainly can elevate our status. But I want to feel like I'm doing something that makes a difference and that it matters. And so as far as other predictors, well, when you ask people what gives their life meaning, the most common response you'll get is family and friends. And if you dig a little deeper into that, it's not just because people like being surrounded by other people. Family and friends help you matter, like because you do things for people and they do things for you. So it could, so a lot of meaning is very, very interpersonal and very social, but not in a superficial level of I just like hanging out with people. It's very much I want to matter in people's lives, and so I need something to do, and that can help explain why meaning connects to work. So, feeling like you have a profession or a job or something in which you're providing for yourself. So, you're self-sufficient in some ways. You're helping take care of your family. You're making a difference in the community. You're contributing to something that you think helps society and the broader civilization flourish. Those are things that help you matter, and they're very much related to, like I said, to relationships. Because what's the point of what's the point of making a contribution to the world if there aren't if it's not populated by people, right?
Amongst young people, you would think social media helps us connect, helps create a large sense of community. But I would ask, does social media help or hurt the conversation of meaning and belonging?
So I think the answer is probably um, both. So, as you probably know, there's a big ongoing debate about whether or not social media is bad for young people's well-being, and there's people that have certainly argued and even documented that certain ways that social media use predicts or even increases anxiety and depression and things like that. So, to the extent that social media takes people out of like deep relationships that are engaging and has people spending their time scrolling or being ostracized, or the whole fear of missing out issue and all that, those things seem kind of bad. But at the same time, social media can give people new opportunities to connect. I mean, if being someone that's from a relatively small town in Southwest Missouri, I didn't grow up with the internet, but having the opportunity to connect with people who have similar interests, I can see would be very cool. So I'm definitely not one of those people that's totally anti like social media or anti technology or anything like that. I do think there are, like anything else, I think there are some concerns that people have raised that are valid that we should think about ways to make improvements on social media. But I also think that the internet, technology, social media have certainly given people new opportunities and new ways to explore ideas and connect with other people that can actually help them pursue the very things that they find meaningful.
In a few previous episodes, I've had Andy Norman and Chris Bale on, and we talked about behavior change and how to really change someone's mind. And I actually, in doing research for this, I heard you talk about how in climate change specifically, talking apocalyptic, that there's no hope, that the world's ending in this amount of years isn't the right way to go about it. And that actually, like, I took a note right when I heard that because that struck a chord with me, and it's all I see online, whether it's political, whether we're talking climate change, whether it's wealth inequality. It's always so apocalyptic. It's always so fear based. And while I'm sure fear is motivating, of course, there's no hope. There's no optimism anymore. And even think about Obama's 2008 Hope campaign. The word hope, it's a beautiful word. And I feel like a lot of people have forgotten about it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about behavior change in young people, why the apocalyptic messaging doesn't work, and why maybe we can shift to some more optimistic tones when we're trying to actually make meaningful change.
Yeah. So if you think about pessimism or hopelessness, essentially what you're saying is, well, we know you're going to do something with your time. You're going to do something with your time. You're going to have goals and interests. Right? You're going to move forward with life. But if we say there's really no hope to accomplish X, whatever that is, that's a pretty clear cue if you're a rational human being to don't spend your time doing anything focused on that. And so if you have a general worldview about, well, everything about the future is hopeless, then it gives you an excuse to say, well, I should just indulge and I should just enjoy my life and do what I want. And so I feel like the hopelessness, the pessimism is a very hedonistic response, because it's saying, well, you don't have any responsibility to do anything because that would be a waste of your time as a rational human being. And so that's obviously not helpful if you actually think there's things we can do to further human progress. And so as far as to why that message seems to have taken root, I'm not really sure, but I think it does relate to these other issues of anxiety, of growing anxiety, social distrust. Because what happens is the psychological states are interrelated. So what happens is if you feel anxious, and if you feel distressed in some way or depressed, like you turn inward. You don't want to go out and take risks and try new things and be open-minded. You become more defensive and dogmatic. And so I think when people are in these kind of anxious states, and I've seen numbers like from the Pew, Research Center that a high percentage of young people think people are just out for themselves and they're not trustworthy. If you have that mindset, then it does just kind of turn you inward, and then these different things feed off of each other. Well, I don't think people can be trusted, so obviously we're not going to be able to come together and solve this problem, so it's hopeless. But that causes more of that feeling. Well, if things are hopeless, what's the point of taking a risk, putting myself out there, and trying to trust people? And so I think they're very they're very kind of like self-reinforcing attitudes around fear and anxiety. But if you feel hopeful, if you push yourself out of that and you feel optimistic, and you don't feel afraid, but you feel bold and energized, then that's when you're, instead of turning inward, you cognitively expand outward. You become more curious. You become more willing to give people a chance. You become more resilient and hopeful. And so I think these are the types of traits we need to encourage and cultivate if we want to solve some of the big challenges that people say they're very concerned about.
That is probably one of the most important notes I took in doing research from one of your previous interviews. The number one thing I hear from our listeners and young people on social media, they feel burnt out with all the big news articles. They feel hopeless that momentum has shifted. They feel like if change could have happened, it would have happened 20 years ago. They're already too late. You hear the word too late a lot. So the idea of introducing hope in terms of trying to market and inspire young people seems like the most important takeaway from today. So I appreciate that a lot. And I hope everyone takes that with them when they're trying to change behavior in a small or big way. Keep it light, keep it hopeful and inspirational, because you go on Twitter for 5 minutes, you're going to feel burnt out as well. Wrapping up, this has been discussed a lot, but I have to ask it as we wind down the episode. 2020, 2021, there's been real world isolation. People are working from home. They're doing classes from home. Beyond the social media question, have you noticed any changes in people asking themselves about meaning, because they are now physically, not even just emotionally, they're physically isolated? Has there been any changes in your work with how people's lives have inevitably changed?
Yes, and I think one, silver lining perhaps of this whole pandemic experience, which has obviously been very bad, not just because of, the actual disease and lives lost, but the economic challenges that, people have lost jobs, businesses have closed, there's been, people have been increased loneliness, mental health problems. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of bad things. But one of the silver linings, I think, is that you're right. It has caused people to stop and to reflect on what's important in their lives. And you can see this in a number of interesting statistics. For instance, you see now a growing percentage of people interested in continuing remote work, not as a way to be like, I don't want to go to work, but really as a way to say, is there an opportunity for me to live closer to family? Is there an opportunity for me to walk my kids to school and home from school? Is there an opportunity to think more holistically about life? And so what happens when you have big disruptions in society and in your own personal life is it breaks habit, like it breaks routine, and it puts you in a situation to say, well, maybe I could do things differently. And this is actually connects to nostalgia, because one of the functions of nostalgia is that helps people really, kind of focus or highlight what is important in their life. And they look back on their memories and they say, oh, like these are the things that I really cherish. I should do more of that stuff so I can build more of those types of memories in the future. And in a very busy, fast-moving society like we have here in the U.S., I feel like we often don't, we're often caught up in the moment and don't take that time to stop and reflect and think about, am I doing what I want to do? Am I doing what's best for my well-being and for my family? And I think the pandemic has given a lot of people the opportunity, and really just, if nothing else, like you said, just by being stuck at home sometimes, you're thinking more. You're in your head a little bit more, and you're thinking about, oh, what do I want to do? And I think it's also made people more likely to not want to take life's simple pleasures for granted, like going out with friends, going to a concert, going to a restaurant. And that can be good too because it makes you grateful and it makes you think, oh yeah, there's something nice about, like, for instance, for me, early in the pandemic when it really was, well, we don't know what's going on here and we should kind of stay home as much as possible. I was still going to work, but my building was pretty empty. Most people were working from home. It did create a sense to me of, oh, free, of really valuing the freedom of movement to go do things, just to walk into a grocery store, just to go into a bar and have a beer, to go to the gym. And so I think it certainly increased my appreciation of how fortunate we are in our modern affluent society to have access to a thriving economy and lots of businesses and opportunities and leisure activities.